Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another hobby vlog video. I wasn't planning on recording a video for this, but I had just finished doing the very initial stages of one of my Blood Angels models, being the ballistus dreadnought that you see over here, and I noticed something really funny that made me stop and take the camera to record because I figured it'd be a good topic and interesting video to put out. So, as many of you know, my first army, well, my most recent army before Votann, and my main army was Blood Angels. And I ended up taking an extended break, basically abandoned the project, and went into Votann. And how that happened was I had about 750 points painted up. I had about another 1,000 points unpainted, and I just kind of got fed up with the painting process I had established for the army because it just took way too long, it took way too much time, and I didn't have it in me anymore to paint the rest of my models in this style. And so what happened was eventually it just slowed down to a point where I figured I needed a palette cleanser. I picked up some Leagues of Votann models, started painting it with a different process, and I completely fell in love with it, as many of you know, and it's been my main army ever since. So Blood Angels has just kind of sat on my shelf. Whatever was painted is up there, whatever's unpainted is in a box, and I kind of just forgot about it until one of my friends reached out with some interest in playing a game of 40k, and he never played before. So I figured, hey, perfect opportunity, come on by, I'll lend you an army, you can play with my Blood Angels, and I'm going to build him a nice little 750 point list. He gets to try it out, and we'll have some fun while I play with my Votann. So I was building a little list, taking a look at what I had available, giving him a nice mix of options. And one of the funnest things or coolest things in this game is obviously seeing your painted models on the table, but more importantly, seeing cool models on the table. And the dreadnoughts for Space Marines are really, really cool. And I had this ballistus model that was laying around ever since Leviathan first came out. I didn't buy the box, but I picked it up on sale secondhand, and it was just sitting there primed and waiting to never be painted because the process just took way too long and I gave up on it. But I figured, hey, all I need to do is paint this one model and my friend could have a really cool small force to play with on the table, get to test out a bunch of different unit options, unit roles, and, maybe it would hook him in if he got to play as this giant dreadnought on the table. It's cool, so why not? So I decided to take it out and start the painting process, which I was absolutely dreading. But to my surprise, it was actually pretty enjoyable. And not only was it enjoyable, it came out way better than anything else I ever painted for Blood Angels. And I haven't painted Blood Angels in months, at least 6 months. So what happened? Well, you can see here, these were some of my more recent models I had painted right before I stopped, leading into my exhaustion and fatigue with the paint scheme and just putting everything on hold indefinitely. And so the first one here that you see is the Bal Predator. And so the Bal Predator was the first vehicle I tried doing for the army after knocking out a bunch of infantry. And the infantry were very long, so I figured, okay, let me try this scheme out on a vehicle and see how it goes. So I used airbrushing for this because my goal at the time was to learn how to airbrush more effectively and just get better at it. So I picked up an airbrush and I picked up this army and I started having a go at it. And what you see here is my very bad and novice attempt at trying to do an undercoat highlight with some white and then applying some very thin layers. And it's very heavy-handed and unsubtle. You could just see it popping out at you, which, I mean, for some people it might be nice, but I look at this and it just looks very amateurish. So it was tough. It was really hard because if you don't have a lot of experience using an airbrush, getting the technique down, knowing how much pressure to apply, how many layers to put on, it's a little bit tough. But I tried with the zenithal, sort of like a pseudo zenithal underneath with some white spray that I was using with my airbrush, and then I started layering. And what you see are some very small imperfections that really shone through. So the biggest ones obviously is that it looks too vibrant in the areas that are highlighted compared to other areas of the model that are much darker. So there's no smooth gradient transition. It's very overt. And that was because in these areas, I tried putting a lot of white so that I could get a really clear contrast, and I did get a clear contrast, but like I said, it's just way too overt, and there's no finesse to this job. So I was a little disappointed. You also see here some imperfections with some splattering and some webbing that was happening, so I tried to correct it with my undercoat. It just didn't work out well, and so you see these big blotches of bright colors on the model, which really don't look natural and look a bit out of place. So I was a little disappointed with this, but it was my first go. It took a long time to do. I can't stress that enough, because you basically have to set everything up with your primer and go in with the airbrush and put some white, make everything gray, build your layers with the white first, and then you apply your different reds to get very, very light layers that make the highlights naturally appear. And once that's done, you have to go in and block everything with black, and then just start over with the actual painting process. So it's really, really long. I decided after finishing this, I wanted to try one more go at it, so I picked myself up a Scorpius. I think it's a Scorpius launcher. This is the Horus Heresy equivalent of a Whirlwind tank for Space Marines in 40K. So I picked one of these up. I thought it looked cool, and I wanted to try painting this one. So I had another go, and I do find it looks a lot better. There's less imperfections that are noticeably visible on the model, but again, I couldn't get those smooth transitions. It was very overt again in the front. It looks like the vehicle's blushing on its cheeks, and I don't know, it looks a little unnatural and a little bit silly, but I tried. It took a long time, and at that point I had finished everything, and I said, I think I'm done. I don't really want to do this anymore. I need a break. And then that's when I picked up the Votan, and I got into Votan instead, because it took a fraction of the time to paint up a full squad of units versus just one model. So I ended up just abandoning the project and keeping it on my shelf. But now, anyway, I had an incentive to try to paint this one model up, and I was feeling a little bit nervous about it because I hadn't done this project in at least 6 months. I've just been doing Votan exclusively, but I figured, what the heck, it could be fun. It's a different type of project, a different paint scheme, a different process, and if I get this done, my friend will probably have a better time playing the game, which is a win-win. So I grabbed it, I started going at it with the airbrush, and to my surprise, it came out really, really nice. Like at least 3 times better than the other models I painted. It's not perfect, far from it, but I'm blown away with how much better this came out than the models I was trying to paint while I was engaged with this army. I came into this haphazardly. I said, it's not going to come out nice. Who cares? There's no point in trying too hard. Let me just have fun with it. And I had fun with it. I went through it pretty quick. I didn't overthink it too much. And I got these really nice and smooth transitions. I can't believe it. I'm looking at it now. I still can't believe it. It's so funny to me because I didn't try as hard as I did with the original vehicles. I just sort of went in and I said, okay, as long as I get this thing red and I get it on the table, it's fine. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but there are some really nice distinct layers that you see based on the lighting where it's focusing down on the model from. I got some really thin highlights down the middle, good airbrush control, which really took me by surprise again. So I was blown away. I was really happy with how this came out. And it's so silly because it shouldn't have come out like this. I thought, for all intents and purposes, I thought it was going to come out way worse than the other ones, the other tanks I worked on. I was really surprised. So I kept going with the model and did the next step, which is always the longest, and this is the blocking. You basically pick out everything that's not the main red armor in black. No matter what color it's going to be later on, you pick it out in black. So I went through the entire model today, and it took me 3.5 hours to pick out everything in black. So already we're sitting at about 4.5, 5 hours just to get this at base level where nothing is colored in, there are no highlights, and there's no recess shading. And at this point, I remembered 2 things. I remembered the first reason why I gave up on this project to begin with, and that's because my process sucks. It is way too long to do an entire army in this style. It's too long. I'm never going to get it done. And the second thing I remembered is why I started this project to begin with, and that's because once you get the black blocked in, the model comes to life, and it looks so nice on the table. So nice. But now we have this conundrum, because On the one hand, you have a process that creates something that to you is really beautiful to look at. And it's not perfect, it's obviously flawed, but to me, it looks really, really nice. And it motivates me in the moment to want to collect and play with an army like this. But the realist in me knows, after painting this and going through it, that it's simply unsustainable to get a whole army out like this. Especially if I'm trying to get it out in a certain amount of time to be able to play with it within a reasonable time frame, it's just not possible. So what do we do? What do we do in a situation like this where we like how something looks, but it's just not realistic to apply it to a whole army? And I'm really not sure. I think back to my Voltat army and what made me have a better time painting overall, and just the speed at which I was able to get things out of and the enjoyment I got out of painting compared to the process I had established here with my Blood Angels. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is when I started this project with my Blood Angels, my goal was to get better at using the airbrush. It wasn't really to get an army on the table or just get a massive collection. I really just wanted to improve my airbrush control with an army that I thought looked really nice and start really small. But as soon as I got one model completed, I absolutely fell in love with the aesthetic, and I figured I'd just make the whole army like that. And I think that's where I went wrong, because army painting is not the same as painting one model. Army painting is painting a bunch of models, sometimes models that you hate or things that are redundant. So you got to paint 15 of the same infantry, for example, and you get tired of that. You don't have that same, for me anyway, I just don't get the same pleasure out of painting one big unique model versus painting smaller ones. I know that this goes against the motto, but when I start a project, the first thing I paint always the HQ every time, the most badass model, and then I do the infantry. And it should be the opposite, because you want to practice the scheme first on something that's less impactful. But for me, part of the joy of painting and being in this hobby is painting things that are cool and really just looking at how nice they come out when you put in a lot of effort. And you don't really necessarily get to feel that when you're doing a bunch of squats. You can't. It's just not sustainable. And I think you need to compromise and maybe change the process. If you're working on a bunch of infantry instead, you gotta cut corners, you have to find shortcuts, you have to do things that might be less pleasurable to you as a hobbyist and a painter if your goal is just to get something on the table and have it look half decent. All that to say, I think it's pretty cool that my main project from back in the day became my palette cleanser for Leagues of Votann, which was originally the palette cleanser for the main project. And how using Blood Angels now as a palette cleanser actually allowed me to get better results on the army than when I was using this primarily. So I found that really funny, and I wanted to make a video on that to share my thoughts. I guess sometimes we forget that this is a hobby at the end of the day, and hobbies should be enjoyable and we should be having fun while we're working on something. And if we're not having fun working on it, it's okay to put the brakes on and go do something else instead that we find enjoyable or brings us pleasure. And of course, maybe sometimes we just really want to paint one single nice model and not necessarily have to upgrade that to a full army on the table, because we might not have fun doing it. Anyway, I hope that this is somewhat relatable to everyone else out there who also engages with this hobby. Let me know if you guys have experienced a similar feeling like this when it comes to army painting. How do you deal with it? If you want to have a certain standard on the table, but at the same time, you don't want to lose your mind painting 25 identical models. I'm sure there's a compromise here somewhere. I just haven't found it yet. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.